I'm going to do the introduction to the YSI, and then I'm going to pass over to someone else to do the introduction to Jill, because her resume is long enough and I don't know anything about her, so he does. So welcome to tonight's talk. As usual, you're on the territory of the Kwanlundun and the Tanquatchin Council, First Nations land. YSI, as I've said to some people tonight, is an organisation that helps to bring science to the masses, to explain what's going on in the scientific world, hopefully to educate you as well. I think people that came last night didn't know anything about those, I've forgotten the name of the damn thing now, kimberlite swallow holes, I don't know, but that was fascinating, so we all learnt something last night. Membership, if you join, you help us get the counterpart funding off the government. At the moment, I think we've got around 100 members, but we managed to get in about 40,000 in terms of funding, and that helps us to bring up the likes of Jill and other speakers before. So if you can join, it's much appreciated. Who funds us? Heritage Branch and the and the environmental branch as well. I think that's about it. That's all I got to say. So if I can introduce the introducer.
Thank you, Richard, and welcome everyone. Is this transmitting? That's okay if it isn't, because you can ignore me. Quite frankly, we're very honored and pleased that Jill Heinerth from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society has spent a week in the Yukon. Jill has gone deeper underwater than any other woman in history, almost 500 feet. Wow. She was one of the first to be inducted into the Underwater Hall of Fame, the inaugural member of the Women's Diver Hall of Fame in 2000, and she has been traveling all around the world and inspiring the youth of many ages, the youth from 5 years of age to 85 years of age. And we're very pleased and honored that Jill is going to speak to us today, and she will be posing for photos afterwards, and she does answer questions. Let's help me welcome Jill Heinerth. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just power up the mic. There we go. Can you hear me? Good. Tonight I'm going to share with you a little bit about my life underwater as an explorer. I am the explorer in residence for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and I am one of the few people perhaps in the world that has a business card that says explorer on it. Yeah. And you know, as a kid growing up in the 60s, I loved watching the Apollo missions, and I remember being herded into the school library as a child to sit around a tiny little crackling black and white television set so that we could see the lunar rover driving around on the surface of the moon. And that inspired me. Now, I also remember Sunday nights being a special night around the house because we would watch Jacques Cousteau's Undersea Adventures and the Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. So I see a lot of nods in the audience, and that's because it was a common media experience when we were growing up. I mean, what did we have? 2 channels, you know? And so everybody saw the same stuff on the same night. And that was the one night for us that we could sit in the den and eat our dinner and watch TV, and that was huge in my family. But watching those kind of programs, you know, the world was just opening to us. And throughout my lifetime, the opportunities to explore have gotten greater and greater and greater. My first expedition happened right around this time here. We went to dig in Bobby Pollard's backyard across the street from my house, and that was awfully exciting because we were digging to China. And my parents would ask me, "Oh, what are you doing?" oh, we're digging to China. That's nice, dear. And then, one day they came over and wanted to pick me up because it was time for dinner. And sure enough, there we were with this great hole in the backyard, and we were climbing in and out and using ropes to lower kids in and out of the hole. Well, that was the end of my first expedition. But it did teach me how to deal with authorities and how to handle those situations when your permit is suddenly revoked. But I grew up in Ontario, and I loved the outdoors. I loved being in the water. I learned to dive in Tobermory, and at Tobermory, at Fathom 5 Underwater National Marine Sanctuary, there are literally hundreds of shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. So it's a fantastic place to learn to dive. And, if you've all grown up in Canada, you know that when you've grown up in cold water and that's all you have, you just do it, until you go to the tropics for the first time, and then all bets are off, right? But my work has taken me all around the world to fantastic and surreal places, like this location in Egypt near the Libyan border. And you can ask, why on earth would you go there to dive? But I was chasing the fact that I knew there were oasis springs in the desert, and I thought, all right, well, what are these springs? What are these oases? Where does the water come from? And is there caves that might be linking them together? But I've also spent a lot of time in very cold places, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Last summer, I spent some of my time camping 700 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle on the sea ice, doing a project that I've called Arctic on the Edge, looking at how global climate change is changing the North. I mean, in the North, we're seeing things change about twice as fast as anywhere else on Earth. And the sea ice, which is the land to the indigenous people, is disappearing faster and faster. I mean, the previous winter, the ice set up safe for travel in about February, but it started to melt again about March 18th. So as their land disappears, the way of life and the wildlife changes very, very rapidly. I also spend a lot of time in North Florida and in places that look like this. This might not look too appealing in a North Florida swamp, but beneath these swampy holes are beautiful, clear water springs that issue spring water from the Floridan aquifer. And for the last 20 years, I've made Florida my second home, and there are about 200 cave springs within an hour of where I've been living there, and they're remarkable places to explore. So caves are my specialty, and many people might say, well, gosh, why on earth would you want to explore an underwater cave? But I can show you this picture and say, this is why. These places are like cathedrals. Now, most people think of underwater caves or caves in general. maybe someone else can help me also get the volume on the laptop to come up if we have an audio person in the room. Video source volume up. The volume from my laptop. It was up before. I think there was a source here. Maybe we need to turn on. So that's it? Okay. Okay. We'll try it on the next video. All right. My first expedition was back in 1995 in the Mexican mountains, the Sierra Mazateca Mountains in the middle of Mexico. And this was in an attempt to study what we thought could become the world's deepest cave system. Now, there's still a battle going on. There's a very deep cave in the Ukraine, and then there's this system in Huautla, which is a rival to that cave system. In fact, at this very moment, colleagues of mine are inside the mountains exploring these cave systems that are like doing a reverse Everest. I mean, imagine climbing in the peak of a mountain, traveling through caves, through literally miles of rope, down waterfalls, through underground rivers, and reaching sumps. This would be a sump when you reach a point in the cave that's filled with water. And if they're successful, they'll make it the world's deepest cave. Now, they'll spend months inside these cave systems. And if you spend even a week inside a cave system, you'll find really unusual things start happening to your body. You actually start growing fungus and strange things, as well as like the tough challenges on your mind. But my job in 1995 was to work from the bottom end of this mountain upward to try and meet their exploration from the top down. So we went there and established a base camp about 6,000 feet down the mountain in a canyon where all the water from the mountain came pouring out of a hole that's called a resurgence. So the water comes out of this hole like a giant gushing fire hydrant in the rainy season. So we went down the mountain, established our base camp, and as we got closer to the location, I had been promised water that looked like this. This is just inside the entrance of that resurgence cave. And the water's very clear, and it looked like a really promising place to work. But in 95, when I went there, I noticed, hiking down the river, that the water wasn't very clear. And the closer that we got to where we established our base camp, it got worse and worse. And throughout the course of that expedition, we experienced mudslides in the mountain that were obliterating the visibility inside the caves that we were trying to map and explore. But my colleague, Dr. Bill Stone, at the end of this project, said to me, "How would you like to map a cave that you can't even see?" And I said, "Great, that would have been handy." And he declared, "All I need is $750,000 and 2 years, and I will build the device." Now, I was already pretty convinced that this man was quite brilliant, and so I completely bought into the dream. And sure enough, 2 years later, he delivered on that dream. So in 1987, Bill Stone was working on some technology to use in his cave explorations and also for future work in space. And in 1987, in this photo, he did the first ever 24-hour dive using a device called a rebreather. Now, how many people in the room are scuba divers? A few? Oh, quite a few. Okay. Normally, when you scuba dive, you wear a tank on your back, you inhale a breath from the tank, and then when you exhale, you make bubbles. So whatever you've inhaled, you exhale and lose that gas to the water column. With a rebreather, we recapture those bubbles, send it around a loop through a carbon dioxide scrubber. We remove the carbon dioxide and then add a little bit of oxygen and bring that gas back around to the diver again. So we're recycling the gas over and over and over, and it extends our range and our depth potential. So in 1987, he did the first ever 24-hour dive on a rebreather on his Cislunar Mark I. Well, 10 years later, when we arrived at this place called Wakulla Springs, we were using the Cislunar Mark V rebreathers to make what I would think was the greatest advancement in technical diving to date. Now, we arrived on site with a lot of pretty crazy equipment because we needed to do some very advanced dives, things that had not been done before. And we borrowed and rented a lot of equipment from the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas industry, and we got a lot of volunteers with a lot of vision together to pull this project off. Now, the main parts of the project included this mapping device in order to map the cave, whether we could see it or not. And at the front of this mapping device are a bunch of discs that are actually a sonar array. So as you drive this mapper through the cave system, literally it's bouncing a sonar signal off the walls, and it's recording the distance from the mapper to the wall back and forth. And that's happening in 24 directions 4 times a second. So all of those distances are logged inside 5 Pentium processors inside the mapper. There's also an inertial guidance system from a cruise missile in this thing, and giant batteries to propel it through the water. Now, this was obviously before 9/11, because you can imagine it would not be all that easy to buy an inertial guidance system today. So there I am driving this mapper, using a rebreather, carrying some extra scuba tanks for bailout. But as the range and depth of this project got greater and greater, we actually got to the point where we were wearing 2 rebreather devices. And we would be driving a mapper or a scooter through the cave system. We'd be dragging an extra vehicle for an abort vehicle in case the first one broke down. We'd be wearing a couple of rebreathers, carrying 4, 5, 6 extra scuba tanks. We'd also dropped basically a breadcrumb trail of scuba tanks through the system because, again, for those of you who are divers, this cave is 90 meters deep. So to explore something that's that deep, you generally would have very little time. In fact, if you just had a scuba tank on your back, you'd have a hard time even getting to 90 meters before you used all of the gas in a single scuba tank up. But what we did was really significant bottom times that required a lot of slow, staged decompression time back to the surface. So our dive missions were 22 hours long or longer, and that required a lot of people to help out. But we were successful in creating that first map. We were also successful in using a new technology using ultra-low frequency radio beacons. So we took these beacons inside the cave while a surface team would track us from the top side. So they could literally walk directly on top of where we were beneath their feet. Now for me as a cave diver, that was the real moment in my career when I was no longer perceived as this adrenaline junkie just out for thrills in a dangerous sport. I was perceived as somebody who could contribute to accurate scientific investigations and study and really offer something for humanity. So for me, this project has a really close place in my heart. Now, this surface tracking technology we take all over the place now. And in fact, a couple of months ago, we took it to the Bahamas and put it in the hands of some school children so that they could track on top of a cave system in the forest where we were working on a National Geographic project. So we gave the kids the tracker, and then we put the beacon for the cave in a very special place. So as they're tracking through the woods, we placed it in the cave beneath this porta potty. So we figured out exactly where the porta potty was, put a cave diver underneath it in the cave system holding a beacon so that when the kids tracked through the woods, they would arrive at the porta potty and think we were inside. But I left an impression on them. It did help them to understand that everything we do on the surface of the earth soaks into the ground and can eventually be returned to us to drink. Another one of my favorite projects was this one in Antarctica. And this was a really early look at global climate change. In 2000, the largest iceberg in recorded history started to crack away from the Ross Ice Shelf. What you're looking at here are satellite photos. It's a whole lot easier with the internet and media today to get sort of real live views of things that are changing. But we were literally over a course of months watching, and years for some scientists, watching these cracks develop in the ice shelf until finally this large iceberg separated away from the Ross Ice Shelf. And at the moment that it did it, it was the largest moving object ever seen on our planet. It's the size of Connecticut or Jamaica. And if we melted that water, it would supply the drinking water needs for the US for at least 2 years. So this thing was massive. To get to the Ross Sea, you have to travel from New Zealand, and that's a 12-day crossing across the most difficult seas on the planet. The roaring 40s, the furious 50s, the screaming 60s. Those latitudes are a place where storms can ring the planet without ever tripping up against land, so they just get stronger and stronger. So this is a calm day, crossing down to the Ross Sea. We did encounter waves up to 20 meters in height. So for me, that was the first time I was ever seasick. And for anyone here that are boaters, that meant we were doing 50-degree rolls in the ship. Now we had an inclinometer in the wheelhouse that indicates the maximum tilt when a wave hits you. And the clinometer pegged past 45 degrees. 45 degrees was where the numbers stopped on it. And I remember asking the captain, I said, why do the numbers stop at 45 degrees? And he said, because you don't recover from anything bigger. And I'm like, but apparently we did. There's a lot of other hazards when you're crossing that ocean, including things like rime ice coating the vessel. So when the waves are splashing up on the ship and they freeze on the superstructure of the ship, it starts to make it top heavy. So every once in a while, when the seas are calm enough, everybody gets hauled onto deck with baseball bats and hammers and has to smash the ice off the boat so it doesn't tip over. Even when we got down to Antarctica, it was challenging to go diving because that year, partly because of this iceberg called B-15, the Ross Sea was really thick with pack ice because there was a lot that was breaking up. And getting in and out of the water in pack ice can be really dangerous. You can get into the water when it's clear and open, and within a matter of minutes, the wind can blow up, and those big pieces of ice can all move in and threaten to crush you between ice and the ship's hull. And if you notice it quick enough, you dive underwater, you come up on the other side of the ship, and hope that they drop this hoist in the water to get you out. So it's a hostile but absolutely beautiful environment. As we traveled to try and intercept this large iceberg, we also experienced some of our Shackleton moments like this, where for over 24 hours we were literally stuck in the sea ice and worried whether we would be stuck and even potentially crushed by the ice, as Shackleton's vessel Endurance was. But after about 30 days down in Antarctica, we really got our diving program underway. We were looking at jellyfish, we were looking at ice edge ecology, meaning we had a question as to whether when a piece of ice the size of Connecticut breaks away from Antarctica, will it carry wildlife with it? Will everything travel along with it? And when do they give up and abandon iceberg and head back to their original home? So we were looking at that. We were looking at whales, in fact. And we wanted to know what we might find inside and even beneath these icebergs. We had an ROV on board, but it turned out that the observations that we could make using rebreathers and even swimming inside tunnels within this ice were the most significant observations. The ice was constantly moving. It's a dynamic environment. And if the ice wasn't stuck on the seafloor, then the entire dive, you and the iceberg and the ship are all moving at the same time. But in some places, the icebergs trip up on the seafloor and create a little haven for sea life. And these icebergs tend to funnel very strong currents underneath. And in places where there's really strong currents, we tend to get a lot of filter-feeding organisms like these that create a carpet of life on the seafloor. Things that open up out of calcareous tubes and open their little fronds like Christmas trees and catch things that are coming through the water on the current. But as you can see, these environments are like sculpted by the water, just like underwater caves. So these scallops that we see in the ice are carved by very high flow, very high currents. The last dive we did on this project in Antarctica was the most memorable. We'd had a lot of things happen that were completely unexpected. but on the very last dive, a current picked up that was almost stronger than we could escape. So our 1 hour dive turned into a 3 hour dive, literally fighting for our lives to get out of this iceberg cave and back to the boat for safety. And after that dive, we were still convinced that we needed one more dive to get all the material we needed for our movie and our National Geographic story. So as we prepared our gear and ate dinner, we placed a watch on deck to let us know when the current finally stopped and we would have a moment to jump in and get some footage. And we heard someone call out on deck with a pretty dire cry. So we ran up on top in time to witness this. So in the course of a few minutes, the entire iceberg literally exploded, cracked, broke apart, and turned into just a sea of endless slush as far as we could see. It was just like an ice cube dropped in a drink on a hot summer's day that cracks and falls apart. So for us, we knew it was time to go home. Now I also work in much warmer places looking at global climate change, and I've done quite a bit of work in Bermuda. Bermuda is actually a volcanic atoll in the middle of the Atlantic, and so around the edges of the old volcanic seamount are very, very steep walls that go very, very deep into the ocean. There's two other seamounts nearby, the Argus and Challenger seamounts, and so they're all clustered right there in the Atlantic. Now, on top of Bermuda, in the part that's exposed above the water line, there is a limestone cap on top of the volcanic rock. And within that limestone cap, there are a lot of caves. And within those caves, there's some pretty exciting life. I work with biologist Dr. Tom Heinerth from the University of Texas A&M in Galveston. And he's one of the world's foremost authorities on animals that live their entire life cycle inside the blackness of underwater caves. And many of the animals in Bermuda are endemic to a single cave. In fact, a number of creatures that we found in Bermuda, we found only in a single room, in a single cave, and nowhere else on the planet. So these are very, very rare endangered species, and we're kind of in a race against time to learn about them. The animals that live within caves live their entire life cycle within the darkness, and so they don't have any pigment. They have no need for pigment, no need for markings. They also don't have any eyes because there's nothing to look at in the complete darkness. But what they do have is quite remarkable sensory organs, and neuroscientists are very interested in the ways that these animals are able to hunt and find food in a very food-scarce environment. Here's an animal called remipede that we have studied. And remipede is a really interesting little guy. These are actually two separate species. The one in the middle, who's a great hunter, is one species, and these little guys are another species, which I kind of jokingly refer to as the couch potato remipedes. So they just kind of lay on their back and flap their little feet until they create a current that crosses their body and brings them something to eat. Seems like a good strategy. Doesn't take a lot of energy. Now the guy in the middle is quite a hunter, and both of these species actually have venomous fangs and pincers, and they can attack something 40 times their size, neutralize it with venom, turn the insides of that prey into jello, and suck it out through its proboscis. So pretty incredible. Fortunately, these guys are really small, like an inch to an inch and a half, because if they were the size of a cat, they'd be the deadliest thing on earth. Now, what's interesting about these guys is their longevity. So some animals, like cave crayfish, live 200 years, even though their closest relative in an open water river only lived 2 to 3 years. Well, these guys are also long-lived, but we're not sure how long. But what we do know that's interesting about their longevity is that they have not evolved in 65 million years or longer. So we find an identical animal in the fossil record from the time of the extinction of the dinosaurs, and yet we still have them swimming in the caves today. Now, what's really interesting is that they live in young caves. So the caves on the limestone cap of Bermuda are 100 to 150,000 years old, but these are ancient animals. So how did they eventually get there to populate these caves? We don't know. So we find them in these interesting environments that don't look too appetizing from the surface, but once you get underwater are much more interesting. Caves in Bermuda are sometimes in freshwater ponds that we access in people's backyards. Sometimes they're entered through sea caves that go all the way out to the ocean. So this one is a sea cave, and you can actually see marine growth on our guideline that was placed many years before, and there's a lot of marine growth on the walls of this cave. Some caves actually have an interface zone between the salt and freshwater, and that's where we find the abundance of animals in that zone where the mixing is happening. And these are beautiful, beautiful environments, some fresh, some salt, some mixed. So we wondered, these animals that we find topsided in these caves, could we find them in the ocean? Could we find caves deep down the Bermuda Wall that might show us where caves are in the volcanic basement, perhaps leading to these limestone caves? As I was saying before, some of these spaces are huge, like you could fly a 747 through them, they're so big. Some are accessed from remarkable dry caves on top of the island that are worthy to explore in their own right. And my job in all of these cases is to document these environments, take pictures, take video, and support the scientists who are doing their work. So on this particular project, I had quite a bit of camera gear because I needed to shoot both stills and video on the same dive because we had planned to do the deepest manned dives ever conducted in Bermuda. It required a lot of rebreather equipment and backups in order to go down to depths approaching 500 feet. Some of the seamounts that we worked on just off of Bermuda, the very top of the seamount is already 70 meters deep. So we don't even get to structure until we hit 70 meters. But all of this work was done with volunteers, again, working with NOAA and working with the Texas A&M University at Galveston. So we'd plummet for the bottom looking for these kinds of things. This is a ledge, and that ledge is actually the evidence of a former sea level stand. So this is about 120, 25 meters deep. So that's where the ocean used to be, and waves used to crash up against a great cliff that rose out of the water. So that kind of evidence is really, really useful to scientists. And in these locations, we were looking for cave conduits, or even relic caves. So this is another sea level notch here, where the waves would have crashed upon the shore. Some of the samples that we brought up from these locations, scientists are still studying today. In fact, I remember one rock that my scientific colleague brought up. We bring them up in the water that they're existing in, and they're kept in that kind of water as long as possible just to preserve anything that might be living on the rock. And it was about a month after we left when I heard from one of the scientists in Bermuda that an octopus had crawled out of a hole on one of the rocks that we'd brought up. A tiny little octopus. I think he was finally hungry. So these dives in the open ocean were 6 hours or more total run time. So it required a lot of support. And quite frankly, I feel a little bit more exposed in the open ocean than I do in some of the cave environments, because when you're out there under a mandatory ceiling, having to come up very, very slowly, you're at the mercy of whatever else wants to swim around and visit during that decompression time. Another place I do a lot of work is the Bahama Blue Holes, and these are some of the prettiest caves on the planet. This we call the frozen rain, because this gives you an idea of how these caves are formed. So water from rain soaks through the porous rock, drips off the ceiling and lands on the floor, and these great columns of calcite are formed by a very, very slow process of deposition. It's just like dripping candle wax on a floor. And it piles up over time, higher and higher and higher. So these formations would have been formed when this cave was dry, when the ocean levels were lower, and they're now filled with water. In fact, many of these caves were dry multiple times throughout history. Now in this cave, we're using a special sediment to tell us about the age of the cave. Anything that you see that's orange here or bright red is actually foreign. So So this cave is in the Bahamas, in Abaco. The red material is from the Sahara Desert. So basically what's happened is that during dry epochs, the Sahara dust is blown up into the atmosphere. It travels across the Atlantic Ocean. It falls down on the Bahama Islands and slowly soaks in through the matrix of sand and gravel and into the caves when they're dry. It drips off the ceiling, lands on the floor, and it creates layers like this one that my partner is sampling here. And you can see this is actually calcite above and below the layer of Sahara dust there. And this is what it looks like if you kind of stir it up. Now, the Sahara dust is permanently trapped inside of rocks. So we can take a stalagmite, bring it out of the cave, and slice it open and look at the layers of deposition, just like the layers of growth in a tree. And we can count back in time and learn about the times when this cave would have been dry and when Sahara dust would have been deposited. And that tells us a lot about the history of Earth. So we can date this particular cave back 350,000 years from looking at these stalagmites. Now, I also do a lot of work in Canada. Newfoundland is a really place that's really close to my heart. I mean, how many of you have been to Newfoundland? You can't go to Newfoundland without coming back with a family, right? It's just amazing there. Well, I definitely met a family in Newfoundland because I've been going back year after year after year since 2014 to explore a really special story about Canadian history that I didn't even know. So in 1942, there were several ships that were loading iron ore from the Bell Island mine onto the vessels. And meanwhile, German U-boats were cruising around Newfoundland and looking for targets. So the Battle of the Atlantic came all the way to Newfoundland. The German U-boats thought that if they could disturb the supply of iron ore that was critical to the shipbuilding effort in World War II, then they might turn the tide of the war. So in two separate attacks, these U-boats sunk these ore-carrying vessels as well as destroying the loading weir from the Bell Island mine. Now, these wrecks today are war graves, but they're also incredible artificial reef environments because when you put a big chunk of metal on the seafloor, it tends to recruit incredible biological life. Now, the story would not be complete without looking at the iron ore mine itself. And these mines that were so important to the shipbuilding effort and so important to the economy of this area were basically abandoned about 50 years ago. Now, over the past few years, they've developed a bit of a tourist destination so that people can tour the upper part of the mine, the first sort of 650 feet that you walk into the mine. But beyond that point, the mine is full of water. So we wanted to go explore underwater and see what was left behind by the miners more than 50 years ago. So I proposed an expedition to the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, which they named their Expedition of the Year, so that we could go look at the shipwrecks and document them and also tell the story of the mine. Now, the mine is amazing. More than 100 men lost their lives in the mine during the course of their work there. And as you go through the mine, you can find remains, like you can find personal artifacts, you can find industrial artifacts, but you can also find things on the wall, like tiny crosses that mark the location of where a miner had died. So there's over 100 of these marks on the wall that we can find where a miner's lost his life. Now, some of these were also whitewashed over, some of them were covered because it was scaring some of the little kids that were going to work there in the mine in the later days. Literally 10-year-old boys were going to work in these mines too. Now, we used rebreathers again because the water's very cold there, and in order to do these long bottom times, we needed that range with the rebreathers and the comfort of the rebreathers. But it's like an industrial archaeology project. It's like diving a shipwreck that's inside a mine because all the equipment's still there, all the piping, the machinery, the pumps, and amazing stuff to see. Oh. Hopefully that's it. Don't want to have a mine collapse here. Right? Now here's another example of some of the things that we see on the walls. This is actually a caricature that's painted with lamp black, and it still survives even though it's underwater. And James Bennett, I don't know if he drew that, or if that's a picture of James Bennett with a little corncob pipe there, or clay pipe. But right around the corner from this James Bennett caricature is an old rusty, twirled up box spring. So James Bennett might have been minding the pump there, but he also might have been taking a few naps during his work. Now here's one of these crosses that you can see. Sorry, I'm having trouble pointing it out right there. Yeah, so that's a location where there might have been a fall of rock, or because there's train tracks on the floor here, someone might have been run over by one of the ore carts fully loaded with ore. So it's quite a remarkable environment. Now, there's also life happening within the mine. So there's iron oxidizing bacteria and algal colonies that we're looking at. They can actually get stirred up into the water column, and we have some biologists in British Columbia that are looking at those. We're also using our dives in the mine environment to study diver physiology, and this helps us understand the effects of pressure on a diver, but also hyperbaric effects that astronauts might be experiencing. So during the course of our studies, we're doing dives and then being immediately monitored by researchers who are asking us to do spirometry tests to test our lung function. They're actually taking blood samples at 20-minute intervals after some of our dives. And they're looking for the biomarkers of stress on our bodies. They're also doing 3D ultrasounds so that they can see how we're assimilating or not assimilating bubbles from decompression. So up here, this is a beating heart as it would normally look. This is a beating heart that's full of bubbles from a dive. So when we dive, we're metabolizing oxygen, but we're storing nitrogen and, on deep dives, helium in our tissues. And when we come back out of pressure really slowly, that gets dealt with and off-gassed just by breathing. But if the decompression is not effective, then we can be circulating bubbles through our circulatory system. Because there's bubbles in this heart, it doesn't necessarily mean that this diver is bent, but it does mean that their body is stressed from these invaders, and that there's some sort of a response. So the researchers are trying to really quantify what this means and whether we could be doing any long-term damage to our bodies. Because it kind of looks like beer in your heart there. Can't be a good thing, right? We're also documenting these environments for stories for television and internet so that other people can learn about these important cultural histories. So let me show you what the mine looks like underwater in this short little video segment. people in Bell Island and the next generation to really embrace this asset that they have and create an ecotourism economy for the future. Because between the wrecks and the mine and the incredible natural environment there, they have a wonderful opportunity. We spend a lot of time in schools with kids, and we do workshops and presentations for the kids. And I remember a kid in this group actually saying to me, "You've been back like for several years." And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, and she's from England. And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, I didn't know we were special. And I thought, wow, if these projects help give these kids a sense of their place, then that's a home run for all of us. Now, I also work with archaeologists and paleontologists on work. I do quite a lot of this in Mexico, Cuba, and the Bahamas, in places like this. So at the top of the picture here, you can see a little hole in the ceiling. This is actually a pipe that leads down to this fresh water. And what we're interested in is this big pile of stuff that's fallen through this hole. That's a drinking water well. So there's a man up top there with a pump handle who spent his entire life pumping water up through that hole to feed his cattle. So we rappel down the hole and take our cameras and equipment, and what you'll see in this picture is roots that grow all the way down to grab the water, because there's no surface rivers there, so this is the water source. And as we swim down that debris mound, we'll find modern trash on the top of the mound. We'll find like the skulls of longhorn cattle, or this particularly interesting one, it actually has silver teeth. So when the Mayans were running away from Chichen Itza and the big civilizations, they were probably taking their household goods, their valuables, everything they owned, as they sought out water and new places to live. And they were probably hiding their valuables in the mouth of these cows. So imagine that poor soul that had to say, "Hold still," while they did the dentistry. We also find pottery like this one that would have been lowered down to gather water and brought back to the surface. And we find things like this Mayan pot that was probably part of funerary observances. And a little bit further down the mound, we find human remains. So remains that were probably cast off in the process of sacrificial offerings as they were beseeching the gods for water. Now, these sorts of things are incredibly fragile, but they're well preserved in the water under these cave systems. Not very many people are ever going to get there to disturb them, of course, but also the water is generally anoxic, so things don't tend to decay and fall apart. And some bones, like this is the remains of an ancient sloth, are actually encased in the rock, so they would be really, really difficult to bring out without destroying the context. Plus, many of these kinds of finds are in places like this, like in Cuba, where there are very little financial resources for scientists to be able to get to the places or to study anything that would be brought out of the caves. We have lengthy travel to even get to these locations, long swims through very technical cave environments, and then we find things that we know are of interest to scientists, but we don't want to touch them. So what we're doing now is we're actually imaging them in situ. So we're using cameras and shooting what we call 3D photogrammetry to do very high resolution, 80,000 data points per square inch, so that we can bring out the digital data to scientists who can either view it in this way, or we can 3D print a model for them. So my colleague, Dr. Corey Jaskolski from National Geographic, has developed the software technology that's enabling this most detailed scanning that's done anywhere on the planet. And some of the things that he's imaged are like this shelf. So imagine everything that's passing by there is a skull, a piece of pottery, a bone, or something else significant. It's not just the object that's significant, but it's its place relative to every other object. So when scientists can see the context for all this material in high resolution, it gives them powerful, powerful data to do their work. And now Corey's gone one step farther. Microsoft sent him something called the HoloLens and said, "Show us what you can do with this thing." So what a HoloLens is the future, really. How many of you have played Pokemon Go? Okay, you can admit it. It's that's okay. So when I first saw people playing Pokemon Go, I thought, oh my God, this is insane. People are jumping out of cars into traffic to capture like mythical things that they're seeing on their cell phone that I can't see. Well, that's preparation for this. This is augmented reality. So I could suspend a three-dimensional object in this room, and if you were all wearing Microsoft HoloLens, you could see it too. So let me show you what that looks like with this short video.
National Geographic fellow Corey Jaskolski has developed techniques to scan artifacts in their environment and create 3D augmented reality that lets the world interact with and even print replicas in unprecedented detail.
I'm National Geographic fellow Corey Jaskolski, and I'm here with my good friend Guillermo de Anda. Guillermo discovered an Ice Age bear that could be about 12,000 years old, and we scanned this bear using 3D scanning techniques that we pioneered deep underwater.
Looking through Microsoft's HoloLens, he's able to see the artifacts in all their detail, projected within his reach in augmented reality.
You can actually see the bear here, sitting on top of the opening to the cave where we'll lower down on the rope and go do more scanning. Some of the other artifacts that you see here are from other cenotes that we've scanned. For example, this cranium is from Holtun cenote near Chichen Itza. And you can see in the 3D view, we can look all around the object and get a really good view of it and actually make accurate measurements. And another thing we can do is interact with the objects like this, rotate. And now we can have the object spinning around and see different sides of it. You'll see coming up here in a moment on the cranium, there's actually some unhealed blunt force trauma that could have been what killed this individual. Stop.
So as you can imagine, this is powerful technology. In this case, we can actually put the Microsoft HoloLens on the Mayan elders in the area, and they're really looking at what are probably their ancestors or the cultural remains that that society left behind. So in the context of this museum here, imagine that mammoth. We have remains of a mammoth like that at Wakulla Springs where we did the three-dimensional map. The Ice Age bear we have in this cave. The ground sloths we have in many caves around Cuba and the Bahamas and Mexico. And in the future, rather than having to invest in the procurement and conservation of those bones or making replicas for museums, we'll be able to create virtual museums. And so I could have you seated in this room and show you one after another these three-dimensional objects that we could examine as a group. So really, really powerful technology. Now that mapper that I drove at Wakulla Springs has taken the next great leap forward as well. This was generation 1 in 1997-98, but now we're up to generation number 4. This is the sunfish mapper, and Dr. Bill Stone has continued to work with this device since that time in preparation for it to go to Jupiter's moon, Europa. So Europa has a frozen surface with water underneath, and when we look for life, we look for water. So if we're going to find life in outer space, it's going to be at a water planet. So sunfish is going to go there and get beneath the ice on Europa and make a three-dimensional map and send the telemetry back to us. So it's a pretty revolutionary idea that all came from a crazy idea that generated around a campfire back in 1995. But let me show you how this device works.
Read it every time. Check it.
Where whenever we're stopped for some distance, they can hold up a message in front, and then you can either go one flash yes, two flashes no.
What does it mean to explore? Exploration driven by curiosity is one of the most important reasons human civilization has advanced over the ages. As humans, we find it natural to travel to an unfamiliar place, to see what is there for the first time, to locate landmarks, and to find our way home. But how do you teach a machine to explore? We decided to experiment in a place that is complicated even for humans, an underwater cave in northern Florida called Peacock Springs. Our robot is called Sunfish. It's an underwater drone that can point, hover, and move in any direction. For now, it has a fiber optic communications thread so we can look over its shoulder as it learns. but it performs all tasks without any human control. It has to make its own decisions regarding what to do next. Peacock is a true labyrinth. There are tunnels branching left and right. There is no GPS. To keep from getting lost, cave divers run a continuous safety line they can follow back to the entrance. Sunfish operates similarly, but instead of a physical dive line, it creates a virtual safety line by remembering its inbound path and a map it creates of what it's seen. The first step is to look around using sonar to create a 3D view. Using what it's seen, the robot then determines where it can safely move without touching a wall, floor, or ceiling. We can give it a goal, such as attempt to go 1 kilometer to the north. Then it will only seek passages that might eventually move it in a general northward direction. But it must choose a route that will get it there while exploring all possibilities. Using these behaviors, the robot can discover dead-end tunnels, back up, and try again until it finally finds a route forward. In the Peacock Maze, we gave the robot a goal of reaching a place called Pothole. There were many twists and turns and junctions to discover along the way. But Sunfish made it to Pothole, a distance of about 150 meters, and then it began the most important robotic behavior, coming home. Sunfish now used the stored inbound path as a guide, continuously comparing what it saw to features that had been scanned on the way in. If the robot's idea of where it was did not match the features seen, then it corrected its path to match the previous 3D map. This way, moving, scanning, remembering, and double-checking, Sunfish completed the first robotic exploration from Peacock Springs to Pothole and back. Autonomous exploration is still in its infancy, but the Sunfish tests conducted at Peacock Springs in the fall of 2017 have opened an exciting doorway to what may soon allow underwater robots to go far beyond what even the best divers can do.
Pressure in the main engine, good chamber pressure in the 3 verniers, and good chamber pressure in all 6 groundlet motors, passing 24 seconds into the flight. Pressure beginning to trail off a little on the groundlet solids as expected, up on the 33-second mark.
So for that little girl that kind of wanted to be an astronaut when she was growing up, I think I got to do one step better, exploring the interior of inner space and connecting that to outer space. And for that little girl in Ontario who was a Girl Guide exploring the backwoods, becoming the explorer in residence for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society was really the wish of a lifetime. So thank you so much for joining me. I think we have time for a little bit of questions if we want to bring the lights up. Sure, yeah, I'll repeat any questions. So, yeah, who's got a question? Yes. How can you become an explorer in residence? They actually asked me. So in 2013, I received the first Christopher Ondaatje Medal for exploration for Canada. And it was 2 years after that that they asked me to serve as the first explorer in residence. Now, National Geographic has had that program for a long time, bringing in explorers in residence and supporting their work. But for the Royal Canadian, it was a brand new thing. So literally they said, will you volunteer and what would you like to do with it? So my first goal for the program was to create this cross-Canada speaking tour specifically to reach kids in schools and inspire them to explore, discover, and try out hybrid careers and understand the value of geography in their lives. Yes? How much does a rebreathing machine weigh out of the water? So it depends, but anywhere from 60 to 120 pounds with its sort of bailout equipment attached to it. So it's heavy. Yes, yes.
You're obviously really pushing some of the previous limits of that. What was your path to get those skills? Because obviously that's really very important.
So the question was, what skills did I need in order to push these physiological limits and technology? You might be surprised to learn that I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts from York University in Visual Communications Design. So it's an unusual career, but I have an advanced degree in curiosity. So I've really been self-taught in many ways. I was an early pioneer in the use of rebreathers and helping to figure out how to use them, how to teach them, and I've been a test pilot for many years as well. So really, so much of what I've done has been self-taught. The Bachelor of Fine Arts might have taught me a little bit about it being a photographer and a creative individual, but when you take cameras underwater, all bets are off. In terms of the physiology, it is still a developing science. So a lot of the dives that I do are certainly off the edge of the envelope for anyone, but especially for women. So that's why I'm very eager to work with researchers like the ones we had from the Divers Alert Network, who are looking at decompression stress and trying to help us for the future in developing safer strategies for diving, but also helping them to learn about issues that will affect everyone. Like when we can understand how our bodies respond to stress and how our RNA actually changes in stressful situations, then we can learn about how to combat diseases, not just decompression illness. In the back. So nitrogen narcosis, yes. So when you go deep underwater using just a regular air breathing mix, your body's metabolizing the oxygen. The nitrogen's pretty useless, and in fact the nitrogen gives us what some have referred to as rapture of the deep, or nitrogen narcosis, and it's kind of a drunk euphoria that can also even eventually at great depths lead to unconsciousness. So the deeper we go, we start changing our breathing mix. We actually introduce helium into the breathing mix and we reduce the nitrogen. The rebreathing equipment actually allows us to constantly mix the ideal life support gas for the depth that we're at to keep us safe from the rapture of the deep, to reduce our decompression obligation so that we can speed our way back to the surface, but also consider the amount of oxygen that we're using, because too much oxygen is also toxic to the human body. It would be like throwing too much fuel on a fire, basically. So we have to control all three elements in the life support gas to optimize the dive. Yes? So the question was, how can we avoid contaminating, like cross-contaminating caves or contaminating the environment? So the rebreathers are actually a very useful tool because we don't make bubbles, we don't disturb things off the ceiling, and so we have less impact on an underwater cave. Now, there will always be a wake from somebody that swims through an environment that may do some disruption, but it's a whole lot less than making bubbles. Now, in terms of cross-contamination, when we go to an environmentally sensitive place, then we have specific protocols. There are some places that only allow rebreathers and no open-circuit scuba. When we go to a place like Antarctica, we have decontamination protocols when we get on and off the boat to ensure that we're not introducing anything that could, wipe out the penguin population. So we do consider those things. Yes? What would I like to do next? I have an endless bucket list of places that I would still like to go. The next projects that I have coming up are some work with Dr. Bob Ballard in California. He's the Titanic explorer from National Geographic. as well as a documentary I'm working on this summer in the Arctic, so I'll have quite a bit of time in the north this year as well. And I feel really urgent covering the story of climate change in the north. It's happening so fast, and I mean, we see evidence everywhere, but when you go to the north, it's shocking how quickly things are changing. So I hope that by telling these stories that maybe we can influence people to make small changes in their lives that could potentially, you know, reduce our carbon impacts and improve the situation. The terror and the airburst. So the Franklin ships are obviously in the news quite a bit, and that's a fantastic discovery. I sure would like to see them, but I kind of like to go to places that are new and haven't been explored yet. So I have some wreck exploration I'm quite interested in doing this fall that are older than the Erebus and the Terror. I won't reveal what they are yet, but it's exciting to be able to be the first person to document wreck environments. But I always work hand in hand with archaeologists, and sometimes it takes years to get permits for these sorts of things. Yeah. So the question was, what kind of preparation do we need to do even before we dive? And it can be hugely significant. There are some of these projects where I feel like I've been preparing my whole life. As you can imagine, when you've got a business card that says Explorer, you're really an entrepreneur. So I don't work for anybody. I don't have like a salary from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. So my career is made up of writing, of photography, of shooting video. I have some books coming out next year from Penguin Random House in Canada and HarperCollins in the US, both kids and adults books. So, and then I consult, so I do all of these things. But that means that every project that I either conceive of, I have to pitch and find funding for, and that's kind of the first step. So there's a lot that even are sitting in filing folders waiting for support. So it can be years of research and grant writing and preparation, safety planning, training, getting a team. And most of these projects, in all honesty, are done by volunteers. So the scientists generally have supporting funding from the universities, but all the divers that are along are usually volunteers. Yes? So will sunfish take my job? I mean, you know, sunfish is going to be able to do things that I've never done before, but I believe that there's something magic in the collaboration between different humans. Now, a friend of mine, James Barrett, just wrote a book called The Last Invention, talking about artificial intelligence. And so will sunfish, you know, wake up one day and say, Jill, you are no longer needed? Perhaps, but I still think that that's pretty exciting. I think the greatest work happens when I'm with scientists. As an artist working with a scientist, I think that we can bring, you know, the left and the right brain together in a way that I don't know if any robot can ever beat. Yes. So how much plastic is in the ocean? This is a huge challenge, something that's really only come to light in the last few years and a lot of people aren't even aware of yet. You know, first we heard about the Pacific Garbage Patch, this great gyre where a lot of plastic was just spinning around in circles in the Pacific Ocean. But what we've discovered is that plastic is ubiquitous. So in the Arctic, I've been with researchers who've gone into indigenous communities and asked for Arctic char from their stores, open them up, and the guts are filled with microplastics, and microplastics that have traveled the world to get to these fish. So it's a huge challenge, and we're going to have to find a way to fight this very quickly, or we're going to lose the majority of the biomass of our fish just from eating plastics. They don't recognize that it's not food until they eat it, and it basically kills them. Yeah. That's a happy one, isn't it? Yes.
The trip you did to Antarctica, where you almost never got back to the ship, was probably one of your near-death experiences. Do you have any others?
So So near-death experiences. Yes, some people say that cave diving is the most dangerous thing that you can do. Most dangerous sport is what they say, but I don't really feel like cave diving is a sport when we're involved in this kind of science. But I have been in a cave trapped behind a scientist that was stuck, and the scientist panicked, obliterated the visibility, broke the guideline that led to safety, and I needed to free the scientist, who was the cork in the bottle containing my life. So yeah, but here's the thing. A lot of people ask me, are you afraid? And my answer is, yeah, I'm always afraid. Being afraid is a good thing, because that's a measure of self-preservation. I want to dive with people that are also afraid, because it tells me that they want to come home at the end of the day, and they care about the outcome. Now, if you're afraid of doing something, whether it's, you know, handing in an assignment at school, or giving a new proposal to your boss, or doing something that you've never done before, we all experience fear. But what I would tell you to ask yourself the next time you're really afraid of something, am I truly in danger, or am I just afraid of the unknown? And if it's, I'm just afraid of the unknown, and you don't want to step into the darkness of the underwater cave or the cave because it's so terrifying, just take a little step closer to that thing that you're afraid of. And your eyes will adjust to the darkness, and then you're standing on the cusp of discovery and exploration. And that's where the opportunities lie. The opportunities to do something that you've never done before, or maybe mankind hasn't done before. And if you then experience that worst case possible scenario where you're stuck, or you're trying to get someone else that's stuck, or the problem is just too big for you to imagine a way to solve, take the same small steps towards success. We can't always see what the solution is, but pretty much always we know what the next best step is to take. And if you apply that to your life, no matter what you do, as a cave diver or as a salesman, then I think that that will take you to a real new level of excellence and exploration in your lives. Yes?
I'm not sure how to politically do that, and I asked you the question, but you were talking about doing all the testing after you do the dives. Is there any differences between men and women doing those deep dives?
Are there any differences between men and women doing the deep dives? Some people say that women are perhaps more suited for, for these types of missions. The truth is, scientifically, we haven't found that women of equal training, equal equipment, equal everything have any more instances of decompression illnesses than men. So, so when it comes down to it in statistics, although it's a very small statistical pool, there's really no difference. However, there's very, very few women that you'll ever meet that will say, hey y'all, watch this. So women are a little more thoughtful about the risk-taking to begin with, right? So there is that documented advantage that we may have over men. Yeah.
I'm wondering how you got the cork out of the bottle.
How we got the cork out of the bottle? Yeah, so stuck behind a scientist in a cave that's about this tall, with the line broken, no visibility, and a panicking person. First I had to calm the panicking scientist. Then I had to patch the guideline, and we carry the equipment necessary to do that. But then in the mess of visibility that was the situation we were in, I lost track of the scientist. So at that point, I was like, I cannot leave my partner in the cave, no matter what. So I patched the guideline, and then I turned back into the cave to go to the point where the water was clear again. If you're swimming into clear water in a cave, it means you haven't been there, because you will always stir up some sediment, just like, you know, walking down a dusty trail, basically. So I went back into the cave till I was sure I wasn't leaving the scientist behind, and then searched my way out. But when I finally emerged from the cave, the scientist was already out and had called an alert, basically. People were converging on the scene, ready to probably not rescue me, probably ready to recover my body, in all honesty, because I was 113 minutes later than the scientist. So for 113 minutes, my friends thought I was dead, and that's that's a big thing to reckon with. That was a really, really hard thing for my husband to hear about and manage and process as well. So it's risk assessment is a really tough thing. I mean, every time I go diving, I have to ask myself, am I prepared for self-rescue? Am I prepared and willing to exact a buddy rescue? Am I doing the best thing for myself and my husband? I have to think about him every time I go in the water. So risk assessment is a really tough process at times. Yeah.
Is there not any communication system you can use to tell divers while you're actually underwater, or sign language?
So communications underwater, most of the time we're using hand signals and light signals. On sun dives, we use full face masks and can use voice communications, but it adds a level of complexity to a dive. We generally only do that for films because everybody wants to hear the divers talk in films. We use it for some scientific work. When we wear the rebreathers, though, we could project our voice into the rebreather mouthpiece that's sort of an air-filled box here. And in that case, we can really train ourselves to understand our buddy. If you went underwater, you would have no idea what we were saying, but we can really practice and get to understand each other vocally in the water column. But it doesn't work with open circuit because the bubbles are too loud. Yeah.
That surprises me to hear you say that given the level of technology that's already involved in some of those shots, it was astonishing how bulky everybody was to begin.
Yeah.
Multiple rebreathers and tanks and all of it.
Mm-hmm. So the question was, with all that technology that we already have, how can this, sound communication add that much more complexity? But a full face mask is needed in order to communicate through sound. And when you have a trapped airspace in a full face mask, you can have CO2 issues that can be problematic. As well, it's much more difficult to keep that clear. It reduces some of your peripheral vision. So there are pros and cons to full face masks that make them challenging. Yes? Will I ever retire, or will I be cave diving in my 80s? Well, I have a friend who was one of the first cave divers in the UK, actually. And he cave dived till he was 83 years old. So hopefully I'll be able to do that. Maybe the equipment will get a little bit lighter, I hope. Yes. My most favorite scientific discovery, well, I really think that moment when we unplugged sunfish and set it free, that just blew my mind. Because for me, that was 20 years of effort, and to have been right there at the beginning was just incredible. But some of my favorite diving moments are the big animals, the charismatic stuff, the humpback whales, the mobile rays, orcas, things like that. Nothing quite replaces those interactions with the wildlife. When we were decompressing in Bermuda, we had a very strict rule, which was stay on the line and don't leave the line, because we're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and if you get blown away by the current, we might never find you. And if you get blown off the line, giant squid, sharks, all kinds of things could be problematic. So I'm there on the line with my buddy Brian K. Cook when a giant manta comes around. And I don't think Brian had ever seen a manta before, and the manta had remoras hanging off it, those long fish that suck onto the body and just opportunistically grab whatever falls out of a manta ray's mouth. And so the manta was kind of sick and tired of all these hitchhikers hanging off its body. So it was coming along and trying to whip the remoras off onto Brian and I. And I've had remoras attached to me during decompression before. But Brian was just enthralled, and I saw the manta ray kind of swim off, and then I heard Brian say, "Take me to your leader," through his rebreather. And then he swam off the line, breaking our safety protocols. I'm like, uh-huh. All right. One more question? Anyone?
That's it.
Okay.
Give Jill a
All
round
right.
of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Does anybody want to have a photo opportunity with Jill? Would you like a group picture on the stage, Jill? Anybody?
I think just if anyone wants a picture,
Okay.
that's fine. Yeah.